The rain came down in needles over the colony of Threshold Station, and nobody looked up. They had learned, in the 3 years since the hegemony established its observation post on the ridge above the settlement, that looking up was how you got noticed. And getting noticed by the hegemony meant forms. It meant inspections. It meant the soft, courteous devastation of administrative power exercised by beings who genuinely could not conceive that humans had anything worth keeping. So nobody looked up when the figure appeared on the northern perimeter at 3:40 hours, dragging one leg through the mud, one arm pressed tight against a wound that had been dressed badly and dressed again, and had long since stopped being a wound and become a fact of her body. The perimeter sensor logged her. The overnight watch, Corporal de Saint-Murand, 22, 4 months out of the Frontier Defense Academy, and already disillusioned with nearly everything the academy had taught her, squinted at the readout and felt the specific cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The biometric flag was not human. She called it in. Then she stood at the wire with her rifle at a position that was not quite aiming and was not quite not aiming, and watched the figure come closer. She was tall. That was the first thing. Orcs from the Varrock clans averaged 2 meters and change, but even by clan standards this one was built to fill a doorframe and then some. Her skin, where it was visible between the layers of what might once have been ceremonial armor, was the dark green-gray of deep river stone, and her tusks, lower jaw, curving upward, had been filed to blunt points in the manner of those who had taken a peace oath. Her hair was black and matted with blood that was not all hers. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them to the wire, were amber, not the pale yellow amber of the warrior caste, the deep, almost brown amber of the anointed. Dessa had never seen an anointed in person. She'd seen them in briefing files, photographs, artists' reconstructions. The anointed were the Varrock clan's living weapons. Individuals born with a rare neurological configuration that allowed them, when exposed to sufficient electrical stimulus, to trigger a cascade of bioelectric charge through their musculature and skeleton, a process the Varrock called the rite of storms, which caused the body to expand. Not metaphorically, not in some vague biological sense. The anointed grew 3 meters, 4, 5 in some documented cases, though the records from the Varrock hegemony suppression campaigns 40 years ago were inconsistent and frequently classified. The girl at the wire looked like she weighed 80 kilograms and hadn't eaten in a week. "I am not here to fight," she said, in accented but unmistakable standard. "I am here because I am out of other options." She said it the way someone says a thing they have spent a long time deciding whether to say, not with defeat, with honesty. There is a difference, though it takes practice to hear it. Dessa lowered her rifle 2 centimeters. She was going to get yelled at for this. She lowered it anyway. "How bad's the wound?" The Orc princess. She had not yet given her name, but Dessa had the distinct and accurate impression she was talking to someone accustomed to not having to. Looked down at her side with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite contempt, and landed somewhere in the territory of an engineer assessing damage they already knew was extensive. "Bad enough that I cannot complete the rite." "Not without help." "Help," Dessa repeated. "I need food, electrolytes, and a clean electrical source. Not for the rite, not yet, just to stabilize." She paused. "I was told humans were pragmatic." "Who told you that?" "My father." She said it simply. 2 words. And something in the delivery, the lack of performance around it, the way she did not use it as leverage or softening agent, just stated it as the source of a piece of information the same way you'd cite a textbook, made Dessa open the gate. Her name was Vihara. Vihara Shanukrit, which translated roughly as Vihara of the Ukrit line, the Ukrit being one of the 3 founding clans of the Varrock Federation, though the Federation was by now mostly a historical term, given what the hegemony had done to it over the previous 4 decades. Her father was Elder Shanukrit, the last sitting council voice of the Varrock, and he had been taken from his meditation chambers 14 days ago by parties the hegemony had publicly declined to acknowledge having any connection to. She told them all of this sitting on an upturned crate in Threshold Station's medical bay, eating 2 protein packs simultaneously, while the station medic, a compact, unhurried man named Orville who had seen enough that almost nothing surprised him anymore, redressed the wound in her side, which was a deep puncture from an energy bolt that had passed through her oblique at an angle suggesting she had already been in motion when it hit her. The station commander, Major Hess, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man trying very hard to think 6 moves ahead on a board where he didn't know the rules. "They took your father," he said, "and then they told you to do what exactly?" "Destroy the colony," she said it while eating, "the eastern districts first. Then here, then the agricultural platforms." She looked at him. "To demonstrate that the Varrock anointed remain functional assets available to hegemony deployment." The room was quiet for a moment. "And if you refused?" She set down the protein pack. "He dies. Slowly. In front of cameras they intend to broadcast on the clan network so that every Varrock family watching understands what compliance looks like." Orville tied off the bandage without comment. He had, in fact, seen worse. He just never had it sitting on a crate in his medical bay eating protein packs. "Why come here?" Hess asked. "Why not just disappear? You got out of whatever they had you in. You could run." "I cannot run far enough." Her voice was flat now, stripped of inflection. "The hegemony does not lose assets. They will find my father. They will execute him publicly. They will send the footage to every clan family as a lesson, and then they will come for me." She looked at the major with those amber eyes. "I am not asking you to solve my problem. I am asking for 12 hours and access to a power grid. Then I will solve my own problem." "And your problem solution involves what exactly from our end?" "Stay out of the way." He studied her for a long moment. The feed from the Ridge observation post was cycling on the secondary screen above his head. The hegemony's monitors, passive and constant, the digital equivalent of a thumb pressed lightly on your windpipe. He glanced at it. He thought about what happened to colonies that made unilateral decisions the hegemony didn't sanction. "Get her fed," he said to Orville. "Then to Vihara. You and I are going to talk about what 12 hours actually looks like." They talked for 3 of those hours. Desas sat in on the conversation because nobody told her to leave, and she was not in the habit of removing herself from rooms where things that mattered were being decided. She was quiet throughout except once, when Hess asked whether the Eastern District residents could be evacuated in time, and Desas said, 6 hours if they cooperate, 4 if they trust us. And Vihara looked at her with the amber eyes, and something shifted in the set of her jaw that might, in a human face, have been called recognition. The broadcast started at dawn. The hegemony's communication officers, smooth, unhurried, projecting the gentle authority of entities that had been right about everything for longer than most civilizations had existed, transmitted on all colony channels simultaneously. The content was simple. Vihara Shanukrit, designated Asset 7 in current hegemony operational notation, would complete her assigned function beginning at 900 hours local. All colony residents were advised to shelter in place. All defensive infrastructure was advised to stand down. The hegemony appreciated the colony's cooperation. The hegemony, it was worth noting, had not actually asked for anything. They had simply announced how things were going to go. Desas was the one who pulled up the news relay. The off-world correspondents had been monitoring the hegemony's channels, which meant that within 40 minutes of the original transmission, the footage was being repackaged and broadcast across 17 systems. The destruction of Threshold Station was, apparently, considered newsworthy. Correspondents positioned their commentary around words like escalation and precedent, and observed tension, which were the words you used when you wanted to talk about something terrible while maintaining the professional distance required to keep talking about it. Vihara watched the broadcast feed from the edge of the main communications room, standing very still, eating her third protein pack. She had not slept. The wound in her side had been properly dressed, and she moved with the controlled stiffness of someone who had decided pain was a negotiation she was winning. "They will show my father now," she said, and she was right. The screen cut to Elder Shanukrit, seated in a white room with no furniture except the chair he occupied, hands bound behind him, expression unchanged. He was old. His tusks were long and uncut, the mark of a clan elder, and his gray-green face was composed with the particular composure of someone who had made their peace and was waiting. He did not look frightened. He looked the way mountains look when you photograph them. Solid and very old and entirely indifferent to being seen. Vihara's hand, the one holding the protein pack, tightened until the packaging crinkled. "He sang to me," she said, "to no one in particular. When I was small and before the right manifested and I didn't understand what I was, he sang to me." She paused. "He has a terrible voice. He knows it. He sang anyway." She set the protein pack down very carefully. She turned to Major Hess. "I need the power grid." The evacuation of the eastern districts had been running since 500 under the guise of a routine infrastructure maintenance drill, which was the kind of lie that worked for about 4 hours and then stopped working. But 4 hours was all they needed. By the time the hegemony's broadcast started, 3,000 of Threshold stations, 4,200 residents had been moved to the subsurface shelters. The remaining 1,200 were the ones who had argued about it. There are always 1,200 of those. Human populations being what they were, you could predict with reasonable accuracy the proportion of any given community who would look at an orderly evacuation notice and say, "Now wait just a minute," and mean it architecturally, meaning they intended to build their wait a minute into something load-bearing enough to obstruct everyone around them. Dissad dealt with the last of them at 8:47, a shopkeeper named Gurith who had been on Threshold Station for 20 years and had opinions about being told to leave his inventory. She did not have time for the full argument. She gave him the short version, which consisted of saying, "I promise your inventory will be here when you get back, but you won't be able to collect it if you're dead," in a tone of voice that communicated she had already thought this through more thoroughly than he had, and then she walked him to the shelter entrance herself. She was back at the perimeter wire at 8:55. The power grid connection point was a transformer housing on the colony's northeast corner, armored and shielded, and rated for the kind of draws that came with industrial equipment. Hess's engineers had run a modified coupling to the external junction overnight, working in the dark, communicating by hand signal, because the hegemony's observation equipment included audio pickup, and they were not ready to have that conversation with the ridge yet. Vihara stood at the coupling in the gray morning air and looked at it for a moment. She had removed most of what was left of her armor. Beneath it, the network of scarification across her shoulders and upper back was visible, the record of the right, inscribed in the traditional Varrock manner on skin that could take it, each scar line a specific bioelectric pathway the right would ignite. From a distance, it looked abstract. From close up, standing behind her as Dissa was, it looked like a map of something that had been carefully planned by people who understood the territory. "How long does it take?" Dissa asked. "The full right, 4 minutes, maybe 5. Vihara didn't turn around. "The growth is the fast part, the control is the slow part. Can you talk to me while it's happening?" "I don't know. I never had anyone to talk to." Dissa absorbed this. "I'll be on the perimeter radio, channel 7. If you can hear me, try to respond, even just a click." Vihara turned then. In the gray light, her amber eyes had the quality of something lit from within. She looked at Dissa with the kind of attention that makes the person being looked at feel briefly and thoroughly known. Why? She asked. Why does that matter to you? Dissa thought about it. Because you're going to be up there alone, she said, and people shouldn't have to do things alone when they don't have to. Something moved in Vihara's face that she didn't name and didn't try to. She reached out and touched the coupling handle. Channel 7, she said. The electricity hit her like a second skeleton, trying to assert itself through her skin. Those were the words she would use later, in the one conversation she would eventually have about the experience of the Rite of Storms. A second skeleton trying to assert itself. The feeling of something larger than her body insisting on existing inside it, and then outside it, and the boundary between those two states being a kind of pain that transcended the category of pain and became more accurately described as information. A massive, overwhelming data transfer from the bioelectric architecture in her cells to every cell simultaneously. She screamed. She had always screamed. The clan histories recorded that every anointed screamed during the rite, including the ones who had done it many times, including the most hardened, and the elders said it was because the body was being truthful about what was happening to it, and there was dignity in that truth. She grew. At the 3-meter mark, the scarification across her back ignited in the pale fire visible expression of the bioelectric cascade, every scar line glowing faint blue-white in the morning gray, a living circuitry map lighting up as the current found its paths. At 4 meters, the hegemony's observation post on the ridge came online. Every sensor, every camera, every broadcasting node. They had been waiting. At 5 meters, when her feet left the ground for a moment as the growth redistribution recentered her mass, the news relay drones that had been holding at the colony boundary, under the pretense of mechanical maintenance, suddenly lifted and oriented toward her and began transmitting. At 6 meters she stopped growing, found her balance in a body that was hers but vast, and stood in the gray morning air above the roofline of Threshold Station's processing district and breathed. Her wound screamed. The growth had not healed it. Nothing healed wounds during the rite. The rite simply made everything bigger, including the damage. She breathed through it. Then she put the earpiece, also enlarged. She had thought of this in her ear and clicked the radio twice. Channel 7. From below, Dissa's voice came up to her, small but clear. I hear you. How do you feel? Vihara almost laughed. It came out as a sound that rattled the nearest building's upper windows. Like myself, she said, and her voice was deep now, shaped by a larger chest and longer airways, but still hers. But larger. Where are they holding your father? This was the question. Vihara had been working it for 14 days. She had 3 candidate locations, narrowed from 18 through a combination of intercepted hegemony logistics signals, conversations with Varrock underground contacts, and the inference work of a mind that had been trained to think tactically since the age of 6. The highest probability location was the hegemony's secondary logistics depot 6 kilometers north of the colony, a facility that officially processed agricultural export documentation and unofficially processed everything the hegemony needed processed outside of its main facility's paperwork trail. 6 kilometers, less than 2 minutes at her current scale, across open terrain. But the hegemony was broadcasting. Every move she made was going to 17 systems, which meant the next minutes were not just about rescuing her father. They were about what the hegemony's broadcast was going to show and what it would mean and who would see it. She looked at the ridge observation post. She looked at the cameras. She thought about her father's composed face in that white room, and she thought about the clan families watching on their networks, and she thought about what compliance looked like, and then she thought about what something else looked like. She started walking north. She walked through the agricultural platforms on the colony's northern edge, and she was careful. The platforms were empty. The evacuation had included the agricultural staff, but she walked between the processing towers rather than through them, and when a storage structure was unavoidable, she stepped over it. The careful thing cost her 90 seconds. She paid them without resentment. The broadcast drones followed her. The hegemony's commentary officer, transmitting on the main channel, said in its smooth and unhurried voice that Asset 7 was proceeding toward assigned demolition target, and the colony could expect impact commencement within the next several minutes. The voice had a specific kind of satisfaction in it that it was not trying to conceal. The satisfaction of a system demonstrating its own functionality. Vihara clicked the radio twice. "I hear you," Dissa said immediately. "They're broadcasting that I'm headed to demolish the colony." "I know, I'm watching the relay." "Can your people signal the agricultural staff? The platforms I just walked through. I want someone to verify they're undamaged." A pause. "You want a counter-broadcast?" "I want the truth to be transmittable." She stepped over the colony's northern boundary wall without breaking stride. If the hegemony wants to broadcast, they can broadcast this. She moved faster across the open terrain north of the colony. Not running. At her scale, running would shake the ground in ways that would be felt for kilometers, but covering distance with the long, even stride of something engineered, over long generations of ritual and selective tradition, for exactly this. The wound in her side informed her steadily. She listened to it the way you listen to an engine warning light. Noted, understood, not stopping. The hegemony logistics depot appeared at 3 kilometers as a cluster of low administrative buildings and 3 larger processing structures, surrounded by a perimeter fence that had been designed to be impressive rather than functional at this particular scale problem. She could see the communications tower, the vehicle bay, the 2 structures with reinforced walls and no visible windows that were not in the published facility schematic. One of those was a detention facility. She knew which one. The thermal signature was different. She had looked at everything she could get her hands on, and she knew which one. She stopped 30 meters from the fence and looked at the facility and thought for a moment about what she was going to do, and how she was going to do it, and what it would show. Then she knelt down on the open ground, slowly, carefully, the wound punishing her for the movement, and put her face level with the communications tower and spoke. She spoke in Varrock. The broadcast drones were close enough to pick up the audio, and the hegemony systems would translate it within seconds, but she spoke in Varrock because she was not speaking to the hegemony. "I am Vihara Shan Ukrit," she said. "I am the last anointed of the Ukrit line. I was told that if I destroyed the human colony, my father would be freed. I chose not to destroy the colony. I chose instead to come here." She paused. "I want everyone watching to see what I do next, not because I am powerful, because I want them to see what it looks like when you choose." She stood back up. She removed the communications tower from the perimeter fence with 2 fingers, the way you'd remove a pin from a map, and set it aside with the deliberateness of someone who had decided that deliberateness was the message. Then she pulled the fence back like a curtain and walked into the depot. The hegemony had 2 mechanized response units at the facility. They were called compliance enforcement platforms, which was a name chosen by committee and had the texture of something designed to be difficult to argue with. They were 4 meters tall, multi-limbed, and armed with the kind of directed energy weapons that had been engineered to deal with exactly this scale of problem. They engaged her immediately and professionally, and with the precise, coordinated efficiency of systems that had been designed and trained for this scenario. She took the hits. The first one caught her in the left shoulder, and she turned into it because turning away would have meant exposing the wound in her side, and she was not doing that. The second caught her in the upper chest, and she stumbled 1 step, and then found her footing in the broken gravel of the depot's vehicle yard. She took the hits and she kept walking. This was the thing that the hegemony's planning had not adequately accounted for. The compliance enforcement platforms had been designed to stop things that wanted to stop, things that flinched, things that recalibrated their approach when confronted with sufficient pain stimulus. The platform's tactical logic assumed a subject who would weigh cost against benefit, who would reach a threshold and respond to it. Vihara had already found her threshold 14 days ago, and had been living past it ever since. She put one of the platforms down with the flat of her forearm. Not a strike, the way the clan warriors trained, but a removal, the way you move furniture. The second she picked up by one of its articulated legs and set it down on its back with the careful attention she'd given the communications tower. These were expensive. She did not want to destroy them. Destruction was not the message. She found the detention building. She removed the roof the way you'd remove a lid. Her father looked up at her from inside, hands still bound, seated in his chair, entirely composed, and said in Varrock, "You're late." "I was eating," she said. She lifted him out of the building, hands so large around him that he was cradled rather than held, which she was aware of and careful about, and turned back toward Threshold Station with him settled against her chest like something worth carrying, which he was. The broadcast drones followed. The hegemony's commentary officer, for the first time in the transmission, was not speaking. The walk back was 6 kilometers of open terrain, and the wound in her side made every step a specific kind of negotiation, but the negotiation was one she was winning. She could hear, from the colony, the noise of people who had come out of the shelters to watch, which was an entirely human response to the situation, and one she found, to her own surprise, affecting. They were small from this height, individually small, but numerous and loud and evidently very interested in what had just happened. She reached the northern perimeter and knelt again. The wound made her vision go briefly bright, and set her father down on the open ground and waited to see if his legs worked. They did. He stood. He looked up at her. His face from this height was too small to read clearly, but she knew that face in every expression it made, and she could read it anyway. He looked the way he always looked when he was trying not to cry and succeeding, which was the expression he had worn when she first manifested the right at age 7, and when she completed her training at 16, and which she had only seen on him 4 times in her life, and which she had, at various difficult moments in the last 14 days, been unsure she would see again. She clicked the radio. "My father is out," she said. Dessa's voice came back immediately, and there was something in it, not unprofessional but real, the realness that lives just under professionalism in people who actually care about what they're doing. "I see him. The east shelter is open. We'll get him inside and get him seen by Orville. Tell him I'll be there in a few minutes. He's watching you right now. He can hear me. He says," a pause, "he says he knows, and also that you need a haircut." The laugh that came out of her at that was enormous. It startled the 3 nearest broadcast drones into altitude corrections. It rattled the processing district windows again. It was not the kind of laugh you perform for an audience. It was the kind that comes out of you before you can decide whether to allow it, which is the only kind that means anything. Then the ground shook. Not from her, from the north. The Vorkai descended out of the low cloud cover, with the specific unhurried confidence of a predator that had been watching for its moment, and had concluded the moment was now. They were not hegemony. They were not affiliated with anyone. They were what the species was, ancient, enormous, and driven by the category of motivation that biologists described as territorial and ethicists described as something that made ethicists uncomfortable, because it did not fit neatly into frameworks designed for species that had developed language. The Vorkai had been here before the colony, before the hegemony, before the Varrock. The plains north of Threshold Station were, from the Vorkai's perspective, not plains. They were its. There were 3 of them, roughly her scale, tentacled in the way the briefing files described, not the stylized tentacles of illustrated monster manuals, but actual biological appendages, heavy and fast and covered in sensory cilia, operated by a distributed nervous system that made targeting specific limbs essentially pointless. Their mouths were where eyes were typically expected to be. Their eyes were not visible from the outside at all. The largest of the three fixed on her father. She got in front of it. This was not tactical. It was not the result of any weighing of options. It was the simple animal fact of her body moving between something she loved and something that intended to harm it, which is not heroism, which is just the most basic math. The Volkai hit her on the left side, the wounded side, and the pain was a white erasure, a full system override, a moment in which her vision and her hearing and her balance all briefly stopped cooperating. She did not fall. She did not fall because falling meant the Volkai reached her father, and that math remained simple even inside the white erasure. She grabbed the nearest of the Volkai's tentacles, not to fight, not with her strength at this moment, but to redirect, to turn the mass of the thing against itself, to use the angle. This was what the Vara called the second principle of the right, which roughly translated as the wisdom of yielding, meaning not that you gave way to what threatened you, but that you found the direction it was already going and helped it go there faster than it intended. The Volkai went sideways. 12 tons of ancient predator, redirected by a wounded woman with no leverage left except the kind you made out of physics and stubbornness. It hit the ground, hard, and when 12 tons hits the ground hard, even things designed to get back up need a moment. The second Volkai came from her right and she hit it, not with elegance. With her fist, open-handed, the way you hit something when technique has been burned away by blood loss and adrenaline, and the white erasure, and what's left is just intention. The impact traveled up her arm and told her something about the structural status of her current condition that she filed away to think about later, if later was available. The third Volkai pulled back, not from tactical reconsideration. They didn't do tactical reconsideration in any form humans or Varrock would recognize, but from the assessment of its distributed nervous system that the cost-benefit calculation had changed. Predators that had survived as long as the Volkai were not brave. They were efficient. Efficiency had learned to recognize when something was more trouble than the caloric value justified. The third Volkai moved north, back into the cloud cover. The first one, the one she'd redirected, was getting up. She turned to it. She was bleeding badly now, the wound reopened by the impact, her vision still doing things she was managing by ignoring them. She looked at the Volkai and the Volkai looked at her with its distributed sensory apparatus and ran a calculation that Vihara could not have described in words but understood in the language of predators, which she had spent her whole life learning. It decided. North into the cloud cover. The second one followed. She stood in the plain north of Threshold Station with blood on the ground around her feet in quantities that were going to constitute a medical situation shortly, and she watched the Volkai go, and then she looked south toward the colony. The broadcast drones were still transmitting. The hegemony's commentary officer had still not resumed speaking. She clicked the radio. The signal was very clear in the sudden quiet. Dessert. I'm here, no pause, she'd been there the whole time. I'm going to need Orville. He's already coming out with the mobile kit, and 2 of my people with a pause. She seemed to be recalculating something. With a very large stretcher that we are improvising right now, so give us 4 minutes. I'll be here. I know. Another pause. The feed is still going, 17 systems. I know. They're not saying anything. The hegemony, their commentary officer, hasn't. I know. She sat down. On the plain between the colony and the terrain the Volkai had come from, in the blood-colored morning that had become mid-morning while she wasn't paying attention. She sat down very carefully, because her options were that or fall, and she had already decided not to fall today, and she intended to maintain consistency. She looked at her hands. They were large and green-gray and marked with the fine permanent scorch lines of the bioelectric pathways, and she had her father's specific configuration of knuckles, which was something she had noticed at 16 and thought about occasionally since. She was very tired. The rite would end on its own eventually, when the bioelectric charge exhausted itself, which took anywhere from 90 minutes to 3 hours depending on the individual. The Varrock elders had names for different phases of the ending: the quieting, the returning, the small truth, that last being their term for the moment when the body contracted back to its standard dimensions and you found out, suddenly and completely, what it had actually cost you. She was not looking forward to the small truth. She looked at the broadcast drones. She thought about the clan families watching on their networks on 17 systems. She thought about what they were seeing, not a weapon deployed, not an asset executing a function. A woman who had been given a specific choice and had chosen specifically, and had then gone north to get her father, and had then stood between him and something ancient and territorial, and had declined to move, and was now sitting on a plane bleeding in the honest way that things bleed when they have done what they came to do. She thought about her father sitting in that white room with his hands bound and his face composed, looking at the cameras with the expression of mountains. He had not performed for the cameras either. He had simply been what he was. She thought that was probably the only kind of teaching that worked, not instruction, not principle recitation, just being what you were, visibly, in front of people who were watching. She clicked the radio twice. "Still here," Dissa said. "Tell your major," Vihara said slowly, each word requiring some assembly, "that the Eastern District structures are undamaged. Tell him the agricultural platforms are undamaged. Tell him the perimeter fence at the northern edge is," she considered. "Tell him it has been relocated slightly." "I'll tell him." "And tell him," she stopped. She put together what she wanted to say with the care of someone working in a second language while also bleeding and coming down from a bioelectric cascade that had taken everything in her reserves. "Tell him I said thank you. For the gate." A pause. "He'll know what that means. He'll know." She heard over the radio the sound of feet on gravel many feet, moving with purpose. Orville's voice somewhere in the middle of it, steady and unhurried, already managing. Her father's voice, closer, saying her name in Varrock, which was a sound she had been holding the possibility of for 14 days, and which landed in her chest like something coming home to where it belonged. She turned toward it. He was there. Small, her standard father-sized father, freed from the white room, standing on the plain in the morning with his long, uncut elder's tusks and his terrible singing voice, and his 23 years of raising something he had recognized. From her first manifestation of the rite in the garden behind their house when she was 7 and had been frightened and had reached for him, and he had stepped toward her without hesitation, as enormous, as worth carrying. He reached up. She bent down, the wound protesting formally. He put both his hands on her face. Both of them barely covered her jaw. He said in Varrock very quietly, "You chose right." She did not answer. She did not need to. The broadcast drones were still transmitting. 17 systems. The hegemony commentary officer remained silent, and that silence was its own kind of broadcast, its own kind of record being set. Somewhere in the relay networks, on clan family screens and colonial news feeds, and in the monitoring stations of the 17 systems watching, a particular image was being received and stored and thought about. A woman, vast and wounded, bending down on a scarred plain toward a small old man with his hands on her face, in the morning light in the quiet after. Orville reached her 20 seconds later with his mobile kit and strong opinions about blood loss and the structural integrity of field dressings applied to beings at this scale, which he communicated in the blunt and comprehensive manner of a medic who had decided long ago that bedside manner was a resource better conserved for situations that required it. She let him work. She answered his questions. She kept her hand steady when he needed it steady. The right wound down over the next 2 hours, the bioelectric charge dissipating in stages, her body contracting back through its measurements in the way the elders described. Not painful, exactly, but precise. Each centimeter returned to normal a specific accounting. Dissa sat on an equipment case nearby and did not make unnecessary conversation, which was, Vihara found, the most useful thing anyone had done for her in 14 days. Not silence that was absence. Silence that was presence. The kind that understood that sometimes you do not need words, you need someone to stay. Hess came out eventually. He stood with his arms still crossed, which she was beginning to understand was not a defensive posture for him but a resting one. He looked at her as she returned to her normal dimensions, which she was aware made the process look, from the outside, somewhat implausible. The hegemony sent a formal communication, he said. 20 minutes ago, administrative language, procedural tone. The summary is that they have no record of any directive issued to any Varrock individual, and they look forward to continued cooperative relationships with all colonial settlements in this sector. She looked at him. That's their acknowledgement that it went wrong for them. That's my read too. He uncrossed his arms. The Council on 12 different systems are already requesting comment. The Varrock underground networks are, apparently something is happening there that our translators are still working through, but the word they keep flagging is, he checked his notes. The word apparently translates as the tide has turned roughly, but more specifically, and more literally, it means the moment when the water decides to go back. Her father, seated now on the improvised stretcher, said, in standard, for Hess's benefit. It is a good phrase, old clan phrase. It means the thing that seemed inevitable is no longer inevitable. Hess looked at him for a moment, then at Vihara. You planned for this. I hoped for it, she said. There is a difference. The morning was late by then. The sky above Threshold Station had gone from gray to the blue-white of a clear mid-morning, and the colony was making the particular noise of a settlement that has survived something and is processing that fact. Not celebration exactly, not yet, but the specific aliveness of people who have been reminded that alive is the category they're in, which has its own kind of sound. Dissa stood up from the equipment case. She looked at Vihara, at her normal dimensions now, wrapped in a thermal blanket over the fresh bandaging, eating her 4th protein pack of the day because Orville had told her to and because she was, in fact, starving. Channel 7, Dissa said. Vihara looked at her. In case you need it, Dissa said. Later, whenever. Vihara thought about this. About the specific offer being made, which was not a tactical alliance or a political arrangement, or any of the formal categories of interspecies relationship that the hegemony's administrative language had developed over its long history of managing everyone else's decisions. It was something simpler, the offer of a frequency, the offer of someone on the other end. Channel 7, Vihara said. She said it the way her father had said her name on the plane, like something coming home to where it belonged. The broadcast drones, eventually, went somewhere else to find other things to transmit. The hegemony's observation post on the ridge remained, as it had always remained, its sensors cycling in their patient and perpetual manner. The colony of Threshold Station returned to the category of ordinary morning, which is the best category a morning can be in, and made breakfast, and opened its shops, and argued about reconstruction logistics in the specifically contentious human way that meant no one was going to be silenced again anytime soon. The elder Shanukrit sat with Orville for an hour and talked about clan medicine and field dressing techniques with the animated interest of a man who had survived something and was delighted to be having this particular conversation. Vihara ate her protein pack and watched the sky go blue. She was very tired. She was also, in the way that only becomes available when the thing you have been afraid of losing is still there, And you are also still there, very glad to be what she was, which was tired and wounded and enormous in the specific ways that did not require the right. And sitting on the plane of a human colony in the morning, with the frequency of Channel 7 available whenever she needed it, and her father's voice somewhere behind her talking about bandaging, and the sky above Threshold Station doing exactly what skies did when nothing was trying to stop them, which was simply being what they were, blue and wide and going on.